These are brave men attacking people who've got massive security networks around them. They have to be totally on the ball. The last thing you want is to be, have some kind of narcotic surging through your body.
It's funny how it's a derogatory name given to them by their enemies. They can't be doing the things that they're doing as humans. They must be somehow enhanced because what they're doing is so beyond what they should be able to achieve. And that weirdly plays into exactly what the Assassins want you to believe. Welcome to Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History Hit. I'm Matt Lewis. We're currently in the Third Crusade, the setting for the first Assassin's Creed game, in which players step into the shoes of Master Assassin Altair ibn Lahad as he fights the Templars in the Holy Land. Today, we're looking at the truth behind the mythology at the heart of Assassin's Creed. Were the infamous Templars and notorious Assassins really bitter enemies? And what were they up to during the Third Crusade? To help me separate fact from fiction, I'm joined by Dr Steve Tibble, author of Assassins and Templars, A Battle in Myth and Blood. Welcome to Echoes of History, Steve. It's great to have you with us.
Well, thank you, Matt. Lovely to see you again.
I can't wait to dive into this one. I've thoroughly enjoyed the book. It's brilliant. Everyone should read it if you want to know about Assassins and Templars, which is exactly where we're at. We really want to know about Assassins and Templars, so you are the right man in the right place at the right time. The very first Assassin's Creed game is set during the Third Crusade in the Holy Land. It introduces us to the conflict that is central to the games between the Assassins and the Templars. This is probably a simple yes or no question. In 1191, in the Third Crusade, are there Assassins and Templars?
Yes, there are. They both exist. They love and hate and interact, and there's a surprising amount of historical synchronicity in the game. I mean, I wrote the book before I really realized what I was writing. I was writing it because they're so fun. I was writing a book about criminals, which surfaced some of the murders of the assassins, and I'd written a book about Templars, so I knew all the material, and then I just put them together. But what I didn't realize was just how it was going to turn up, which is basically the backstory for Assassin's Creed, the original version, which is, in fact, what it's turned out to be.
Fortuitously for us, because we get to pick our way through it with you now. While we're still on kind of broad strokes, most people probably think about Templars as Christian European knights in shining armour with the Red Cross emblazoned on their chest, and most people probably think of Assassins being depicted as kind of ninjas, really, stealthy, sneak attack murderers. Are those broad strokes vaguely true, or is that being way too oversimplistic?
Well, the funny thing is there is truth in both, actually. It's, it's not often you get a caricature that's completely untrue. I would say they're both caricatures. So the Templars were all, on a good day or a bad day, depending on how you look at it, they were all of the things that you've mentioned. They were ferocious warriors, they were elite, they were in the Holy Land to defend the Christendom, the Eastern frontiers. But equally, there was another much bigger side to them, really. Most Templar armies probably had most of their personnel taken from the Arab communities or Armenian communities or Syrian, and these would primarily be Christian Arabs who were the majority of the population in the Holy Land then. So it's a caricature to portray them as these kind of white European conquerors. And similarly, a lot of the guys who stayed in Europe rather than going to the Middle East were lawyers, investment bankers, diplomats. So they were doing all the super high-powered professional services things as well as being killers. And, they were great at both. And I think that's where their enduring legacy is. Very similar with the Assassins, because they were, these ninja-esque kind of characters who you really didn't want to meet on a dark night. I mean, if you bumped into a couple of them, it was very bad news. But on the other hand, they weren't drug-crazed nutcases just killing for the fun of it. There's a a wonderful fragment of a letter from Sinan, the old man of the mountain, who was the guy who was in charge during the Third Crusade, where he wrote, "We are oppressed, not oppressors." And it's such a weird thing to see. It's almost whiny. He's saying, well, we're the victims here, lads. But the thing is, it's actually true. They were a religious minority that were being oppressed. They were subject to lots of massacres from their Sunni neighbors. They were an offshoot of Shiism. So I think with both of them, there's a large element of truth in the sense of, from a PR perspective, that would be the headline of the press release. Templars, elite killers, assassins, ninjas, don't get on the wrong side of us. So that the press release headlines are broadly have something of accuracy. But when you look down into it, it's very different, much more complex.
Yeah, important to get beyond the clickbait headlines. Also, in kind of broad terms, again, talking about both groups, the Templars and the Assassins, in the game, both have a very kind of strict, firm set of rules that they operate by, hence the Assassin's Creed, which drives their actions. Is there something almost cultish about both the Templars and the Assassins, that they both share this kind of drive, this kind of tight set of rules that they operate by?
Yes, very much so. Yeah, and that is part of their mystique. And it's one of the reasons why they're so looming so large in modern mysteries and conspiracies and so on. So the Assassins were, for much of their history, particularly nowadays, quite a conservative, devout group of Muslims on the Shiite side of Islam. But at the time, they were also quite wacky. They were happy to talk about other sects. There was a point in the 1160s where they underwent something called the Resurrection, where they actually decided that they weren't going to adhere to Sharia law anymore. So they started eating pork, they started pulling down mosques, and where if you refused to do that, you'd be killed. So they're quite a wacky bunch, and they were in quite deep conversation with the Crusaders, which may or may not have been about involving even a conversion to some form of Christianity. I think there's an element of wishful thinking from the Crusaders' part, but they were very, very open-minded. They were into a lot of Platonistic concepts at a time when people on both sides, Christian and Muslim, tended to be quite buttoned down and increasingly kind of strict in adherence. The Assassins were they were the kind of intellectually wacky arm of Islam, which is one reason why they were so popular with their Sunni enemies, who killed them whenever they could on many occasions. And it's the same with the Templars. They're on the one hand, they're the ultra sensible guys, professional services, good lawyers if you're doing a transaction, nice people to keep the crown jewels with, they're just very professional. But on the other hand, they have this cult of martyrdom. And it's the only way that they can really express their devotion to Christianity is by looking at this kind of Orwellian view of the world, whereas, you pursue love through death, you pursue peace through war, and so on. And so you find the Templars are actually quite at an extreme end of Christianity as well. They, whereas most Christians would focus on love, salvation, resurrection, those tolerances. Well, in theory, anyway, those kind of issues, they're much more kind of positive things. Whereas for the Templars, when you look at Templar churches and Templar worship, it's much more about death. You go in a Templar church and there's a lot of crucifixes there. It's about the death of Christ and the sacrifice he made to protect his people. Whereas, the normal Christian church would look at Easter and bunnies and, all the good things like that. The Templars did have a bit of a death cult. And that's one of the reasons why the Assassins and the Templars both loathed but understood each other so well, because they were both running this kind of death cult with a fabulous PR machine that made people worry about them, because they were both tiny, tiny numbers of Templars, put the fear of God into people, tiny numbers of Assassins, especially the Fideus, they're kind of hit squads. We're talking very small numbers of guys here, but they're feared across the world, way out of proportion to anything that they can really do. And they do that through operating this great PR machine founded on a death cult. It is fabulous. You can see why they reverberate. They're classic James Bond, baddies on one level.
I was struck reading the book by how much both parties seem to have this sense of they were very willing to die. They didn't necessarily want to die. And I think one of the things that comes out is probably people think assassins and they think, kamikaze missions, willing to, almost keen to die on a mission. Templars fighting battles, desperately trying to survive and win. It's almost the opposite way round to some extent, isn't it? Because the Templars believe that they will do their best service if they get killed in a battle, almost like that old Viking thing of going to Valhalla. And the assassins, you're very careful to point out the assassins very often had escape plans, ways to get away because they didn't necessarily want to die. They're willing to, but don't want to. So it's almost like the reverse of what people might think the two mindsets were.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That is an irony. I think in reality they were probably fairly close to each other, but you're absolutely right. The key words you used were at one point you said keen, and at the other point you said willing. And I think it is very much that both parties are willing to die. They are committed to the cause. They're prepared to fight, be brave, do their duty. There is a kind of a warrior cult thing there, but they're not keen on it. And particularly for a Christian and a devout Catholic, like all the Templars were, suicide is anathema. So there's a very fine boundary they have to watch out for. They have to try and emulate Christ in terms of sacrifice for their communities, and an assassin would say very much the same. They're prepared to make personal sacrifice to protect their communities, but they're not looking for it. It's a death is a corollary of their chosen profession. It's not something that they're eager for. And it does lead on to this whole thing about drugs and, is an assassin called an assassin because of hashish and so on. And it's, to me, we can talk about it more later if you want, but it's a bit of an insult, and it's a deliberate insult by their enemies, because if you're an assassin with a very carefully crafted hit in mind, these are brave men attacking people who've got massive security networks around them. They have to be totally on the ball. The last thing you want is to be, have some kind of narcotic surging through your body, so you sit down and think, oh, it'd be great to have a Mars bar or whatever. You actually really want to get in there and do the job, and it's a very difficult job.
Quite like the idea of getting munchies halfway through a big, well-organised hit. And it's striking, I guess, just on a pragmatic level, these are both, as you said, very small groups. You can't have that sense that we're all going to go out and get killed, because then the orders, whichever order we're talking about, ceases to exist. The Fides can't just recklessly throw away their lives because they're so small in number and so highly trained. And the same is pretty true of the Templars too. So in order to preserve what they're trying to achieve, they can't have that kind of wanton disregard for their own lives.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, when the Templars surged into Ascalon, which is a very important city that the Crusaders were after, and they managed to break in, but then failed. Their comrades failed to follow, and they were wiped out. And it certainly decimated the order in the Middle East, and they lost 53 men. So around 50 men. You think, wow, that's not much. That's kind of like that's less than a company in modern parlance. And the same with the assassins. When they go in mob-handed, you're talking about 13 people. I think 13 was the biggest I've seen fielded. And that was against Saladin. That was somebody they really, really wanted to take out. But normally, the normal assassin squad is 3 or 4. And they try and get away because, as you quite rightly pointed out, there's a very finite number of Fideus, the assassin killers, for the order to call on. The sect doesn't have an infinite supply of these guys who are super skilled and super committed. So you really want to treat them well. And it's interesting, actually, almost from a European perspective. In Alamut, the assassins' headquarters in Persia, they used to keep a roll call. It was very much like the kind of, an English village, where you have the war memorial and the monuments. And they kept monuments to named individuals who died on certain area, in certain hits. It was important that they were remembered. Lest we forget, applied just as much to the assassins as it did to First World War. These were not crazed idiots. These were people fighting for their communities.
I want to go back to talk a little bit about the origins of the two groups. And I guess, we're in Assassin's Creed world where the assassins are actually the good guys. So let's start with the assassins. How does the order that we would call assassins today come about? Where does it originate from?
In the same way as Christianity is split over the years into a multitude of different groups, so Islam split, and the primary split was Sunni and Shiite, and one fragment of Shiism was Ismaili, which became the Fatimid Empire in Egypt, and so on, just bordering onto the Holy Land. Then of course, like all human structures, they decided to split as well, particularly radical human structures. So in around about 1194, the vizier of Egypt, he's kind of like the chief exec, who actually does most of the operating. He's he's the chief operating officer. The caliph, the religious leader of the Fatimid, died, and the vizier decided that he wanted somebody very, very pliant and pliable to take over, rather than the chosen successor, which was a guy called Nizar. And Nizar went into revolt. His followers went with him. They got beaten, and Nizar was killed. He was executed. So you'd think, okay, well, that's the end of the story. That's a fairly predictable story. But they were very radical, very committed people, even in those days. And Nizar and his followers went off to Persia. They escaped to Persia, where there were other Ismailis. And those other Ismailis, led by a leader called Hassan I, as he became, on their side. So they went over and they became Nizari Ismailis, as opposed to the Fatimid Ismailis. And then over time, they sent missionaries out into Syria, primarily because they didn't like the Turks. And the Turks are usually Sunni, so they were fighting against the Turks in Persia, but they sent out missionaries to try and establish a foothold in Syria as well. And that's where we get to the point in Assassin's Creed. Eventually, 100 years on, you've got this set of assassin castles, or really, we should be calling them Nizari Ismailis, but, it's a bit of a mouthful. We'll, stick with assassins. So they have a huge range of castles. They've got their own little principality there, and they're fighting to convert, but they're also fighting to survive. They've been through an awful lot of, pogroms and massacres and so on. They're the kind of least popular kid in the class, and they've been given a good kicking many times. And they respond by developing the Fideus, which is their way of saying, we haven't got a big army. You've got a huge army. You can give us a kicking on one level, but we can come in, we can kill you, we can kill your wife, we can kill your children. And, so there is this kind of, it's the classic guerrilla thing almost, where there's an asymmetry of assets and an asymmetry of application of violence. So Saladin's got his army of 30,000. They can ride in, destroy an assassin's village. But the assassins have got a Fideus army of 20, and they can get to him, and they can credibly pose a real threat to his life and his family, all of which are hugely important.
I think it's really interesting in the book how you point out that both these small groups, the Assassins and the Templars, are really, they're operating as force multipliers. Like you say, it's 30,000 versus 20, but somehow the assassins find a way to make that 20 work better than 30,000 in some cases. They're really working on what they do have and making the absolute most of it.
You're absolutely right. And the Templars is an uncanny parallel strategy for very similar reasons. And you find the Templars at Montgisard, which is a big battle, Saladin's first significant battle against the Crusaders in the early 1170s. The Templars take the center stage of the Christian army. They're fast, the Christians are massively outnumbered, but the Templar squadron is the tip of the spear, and they target Saladin. They can see his flags, they can see where his bodyguards are, and they just go for it. And the numbers are extraordinary. So his army, which included most of the Egyptian army at that point, ran to about 20,000, we think. The Templar squadron was 84 guys, 84. But they're bonkers. So they're like a missile. You can have an army of 10,000, but if a missile is aiming at the center of that army and that general, it might still get through. And the Templars almost did. One of their guys got to within a couple of meters of Saladin. They killed one of his relatives. They punched their way through, and the whole army of 20,000 guys broke. Saladin was nearly killed. He managed to run away using a racing camel. And most of his men were wiped out over the next 10 days when the army disintegrated. So it's like with the assassins, it's it's a force multiplier, and it's focused towards the protection of your community. So the Christian community in the Middle East, obviously, is substantial in the Holy Land, but it's part on the fringes of big Islamic empire, so they're hugely outnumbered. The Assassins, similarly, they're a kind of Ismaili radical group. A lot of the Sunnis think they're heretics. So they're really aching to give them a good kicking as well. And the only way these guys can protect themselves is by projecting force in a pinpoint fashion. So Saladin's got the shotgun of a huge army, but they've got the sniper rifle of a really well-aimed dagger in the back of the neck.
Yeah, it's a perfect analogy, I think. I was desperately trying to think of a way to explain it. And I was thinking of them being something like the equivalent of a longbow when the English medieval army goes over to the continent and people simply don't know how to deal with that weapon. Yep. It's a kind of a strange little thing that you think shouldn't make any impact, but it changes everything. It's that kind of effect, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the asymmetry again, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a preferred explanation for how we arrive at the term assassins for the Nizari Ismailis?
Drugs. That's a simple answer. Kids don't do them, but assassins, that's what they're named after. They are hashashin. But that's sort of just the beginning. They're called assassins by their enemies because these guys were so committed to the cause that their enemies could only explain it by saying they're absolutely nutters and they've been tricked and that they've been given drugs and they act blah, blah, blah. So it's a very insulting term, and it's an insulting way of explaining the dedication of the Fideis. And I don't, for the reasons we were talking about earlier, I don't believe it's true. I mean, the last thing you want, have something, relaxing just before you go onto your massive hit. I mean, the other thing, bizarrely, I think, is that the assassins weren't totally unhappy. I mean, the phrase itself doesn't necessarily mean you're a mad junkie. When the Sunnis use it, it's more used in the sense of junkie lowlife. So you might call somebody a junkie lowlife. Doesn't necessarily mean that you think that they are literally, heroin addict. It can just mean that they're, scum of the earth, which they were often called by the Sunnis as well. So I think there's an element of it's a social element to it, as in they were looked down on as being socially from the lower orders, whether that was true or not. And from the assassins' point of view, in a funny sort of way, I think they might have welcomed it. It's part of the multiplier. Assassins and Templars were both secretly happy, I think, sometimes not so secretly, that people thought they were nutters, because that is the fear factor. When you got those 84 Templars or the 13 Fideis coming at you, it's an oh my God moment. It's not just, it's not 13 ordinary guys. These are people that really make your blood run cold.
Yeah, it's funny how it's a derogatory name given to them by their enemies, and yet it actually reinforces precisely what they're trying to do, because it puts this air of mystery around them that they can't be doing the things that they're doing as humans. They must be somehow enhanced because what they're doing is so beyond what they should be able to achieve. And that weirdly plays into exactly what the assassins want you to believe.
Exactly. On a sensible day, they would have said, well, this is a travesty. But actually, in terms of the overall PR strategy, it's bang on the money. Yeah, that's exactly. You want your enemies to think that you're crazed and fearless, and that you're going to hunt them down to the across years, across space, across time. Yeah, and they did.
So in the game, we play as a fictitious assassin named Altair. Given the secretive nature of what they did, do we have a good idea? I mean, you mentioned that some assassins' names were memorialized. You've mentioned Sinan, the old man of the mountain. Are there some key people who we do know the names of that are closely involved in the assassins, particularly around the time of the Third Crusade?
Yeah, I mean, less so in terms of the Fideis. I'm not aware of a lot of that having survived. I mean, but the problem with the assassins and the Templars is that most of their records have gone, and a lot of the contemporary stuff we're really struggling with. So the Templars' archives were all lost. The assassins were eventually, destroyed by the Mongols in Iran. They weren't going to be looking after the archives. They were going to be lighting fires. But we do know, we do know from chronicles, sometimes written by their enemies, that they did memorialize people. I think and their leaders we often have the names for. So Sinan is a real person, really wacky guy. I mean, he is actually very open-minded. He's quite a Renaissance man by some of our standards, because he was the one who was negotiating with the Christians, with the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, to go into a full-scale alliance, and that was going to be intellectual as well as political. Now, it never happened, because the Templars butted in and killed all of the assassin diplomats who were doing that. I mean, they did hate each other's guts. But Sinan was a very real character. He was a superb leader. He built lots of castles. He had a really good strategy. He kept his people safe and strong. But he was also very open-minded. As we were saying earlier, although in the 12th century, Catholics and most Muslims were fairly buttoned down in terms of what their religious belief was, the assassins were much more kind of, faults on both sides. They were quite tolerant and certainly quite intellectually inquisitive, which can be very appealing.
Yeah, it's an interesting dichotomy, isn't it? Because you tend to think of them as almost like fundamentalists, like this really hardcore group who you would kind of assume probably are driven by their religious beliefs to a fundamental level. And actually, they're some of the most liberal Muslims in Near East at the time, as you say, willing to talk to Christians, willing to countenance conversion to Christian, willing to, deal in Christian religious doctrine and things like that. It's perhaps, again, the opposite of what we might have thought the assassins were about.
Yeah, they're a really interesting group, and they're always surprising. And I have to say, it's not definite that they were proposing becoming Christian. I think the Christians were perhaps fooling themselves, but they were certainly prepared to set off on the journey of a rapprochement with the Crusaders in a way that was intellectual as well as military. They were people who were defending their communities, but they were also, they were out there as well. I have to say, it's like with any human groups, they also change over time. So Sinan and his mates back in Persia, Hassan II, were the ones who helped push the idea of the resurrection. So they were both comfortable with leaving Sharia law, and as part of this broader view of the intellectual landscape, certainly compared to some other parts of Islam. But then at other points in Nizari Ismaili history, they were very, very orthodox. So it goes up and down. But yeah, always surprising.
And so in the game, we get to visit, for example, Masyaf Castle as a base of the assassins. Is Masyaf Castle real? What do we know about the castle?
Yeah, absolutely. It's I think the assassins took it over in 1140, so they'd been in command for 50 years. Sinan wasn't around at the time, but when he came to power in 1162, he strengthened it all. He strengthened the whole network and put in communication systems, things like pigeons, carrier pigeons going around. Very, very good command and control. And it's a very impressive place. I mean, particularly at the time. It sort of raises one of the other big issues that no one ever talks about, and it's kind of like Tolkien and his elves, which is, what do woodland creatures live off? What's the economics of being a woodland creature? And I'm always fascinated about the assassins in that way as well. They live up in the mountains. They build these huge castles, and loads of them, anywhere up to, people talk about 70, 80, some big, some small. And we know the costs that the Crusaders had to build the castle. I mean, how on earth does it become feasible to do that? And I think part of it, and this applies to Sinan as all the others, is it does explain why this very secretive, semi-isolated group were very often prepared to hire out their services. So they'd often be killing people at the behest of one of their Sunni enemies, bizarrely. But I think they were just strapped for cash the whole time. And interesting, when the Mongols conquered them and looted everything, they made the point of saying, these guys don't have any decent treasures. We're not even going to send it back home to the Khan, because he's not going to be impressed. So I think they were fierce as mountain lions, but poor as church mice as well. And and Sinan was a great guy. He was really, really tough and did look after his people very well.
I suppose in Assassin's Creed terms, we want to get onto the bad guys. Big boo for the Templars. What can you tell us kind of briefly how the Templars come into being? How long have they been around by the Third Crusade?
Yeah, so the Templars come into being in around about 1119, 1120. Interestingly, the timeline, but I think people assume the Templars and the Assassins are both very ancient, secretive orders, going back to the pharaohs or whatever. And it's not, of course, it's not true. The Templars were quite a new body in the 1190s, and so too were the Assassins in Syria. I mean, they'd only been, both of them were coming into the area about the same time, early 12th century. And as we've discussed, the Nizari Ismailis didn't exist before 1194, so when Nizar was executed. Yeah, they both have, again, this strangely parallel timeline. The Assassins have been around in Syria since early 1100s. They've struggled to create a kind of safe place. They've tried to inveigle their way into some of the big urban centers, like Damascus or Aleppo, and it always works for a short while, and then people don't like having these heretics around, so they massacre them, and they're forced into the mountains. And with people like Sinan in charge, they really make the best of a rubbish political hand. They end up with the rubbish, least economically viable parts of the Middle East. And the reason that they can get in there is because not many other people want to be there. And then when they're there, they manage to turn it into a really viable kind of military network. And that's a safe place for them to then develop a strategy and push back out against their enemies in the rest of the world.
We've dealt with where the name for Assassins come from. Where does the name for the Templars come from?
Yeah, again, it's we know it, but it's not true. It is sort of, so their early headquarters were at the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, which the Assassins thought was the Temple of Solomon. The Crusaders were wrong, though. It is, I think, it's pretty much what we'd call the Al-Aqsa Mosque now, which actually postdates that significantly. But it's a catchy name, It is sort of like, and it's sort of to your point about the Assassins as well. They both ended up with catchy names because this cult of death rests to large part on them having a larger-than-life image. And I think they're both, I think a branding agency, in the 21st century would tell you could do a lot worse than Assassins and Templars. They're powerful brands that actually say what the promise is. It's a promise of death.
Well, I mean, here we are more than 800 years later, still talking about the brand recognition of the Assassins and the Templars. Somebody should have got a decent paycheck for that bit of work. And we've talked a bit about how the Assassins became this kind of force multiplier. What makes the Templars able to do that too? Because again, we're talking about normally fairly small groups of knights. What distinguishes them from all of the other European knights that are arriving in the Holy Land around this time?
I think discipline is the key thing, and commitment, which again is what you find with the Assassins. These are guys who give themselves up totally to the objectives of their sect or order. So in the same way as the Assassins are, totally in thrall or totally obedient to the old man of the mountain, you find the Templars the same. They've got a very, very tight rule book, called the Rule of the Templar. They're sort of, they take monastic vows of a certain kind. They are totally devoted. And because they're in the Middle East and they're in the saddle the whole time, they are superb soldiers. And they're used to maneuvering together. They know exactly what to do under all the different circumstances. And warfare in the East is very different. Whereas if you look at the European knights that come over on crusade, they're much less well trained because mostly they're doing a bit of carousing at home. They don't get to fight in really vicious warfare very often. They don't get to maneuver because they're all spread out around different countries, and they don't know how to deal with these Turkic cavalry. They don't know how to deal with artillery when they're in Europe. So the Templars they look very similar on one level. You think, a cavalry charge, medieval knights charging. They must be the same. But in fact, the Templars were so much better at it because they were disciplined. They pushed it through, and they knew where to hit. Like at Montgisard, you identify, that's how you get a much more mobile enemy to succumb. You point at the one point of vulnerability where they're a fixed item, where the baggage train is, where the general is, where the flags are, and you try and cut it off at the neck, And I think it's a hard one to pin down because they don't really have a technological edge, but they do have discipline and an ideological edge. It's again back to your point about keen or willing. They're not keen to die, but they're certainly willing to do it, and they know in themselves, they have this belief that it's effectively being on the fast track to heaven if you do that. It's not something you seek, because that would be suicide, but it's something that you embrace. If in doing so you can fight for your community.
There's almost like a chicken and egg question to be had here about are the best knights with all of the best tactical nous seeking out the Templars, or is there something about the way the Templars train their brothers that turn them into these elite fighting knights with better discipline and better understanding of battle tactics than anybody else? So are the Templars drawing the best to them, or are the Templars forging the best out of what they get?
Yeah, I think you're right first time, chicken and egg. So I think the Templars have a mechanism for turning strong, brave, committed people into this kind of superhuman military machine. They've got a welcome pack in the form of the rule of the Templars, where people absorb that, and they're turned out like a regiment in a way that most medieval troops really aren't. So they do have the kind of secret ingredient to turn a good warrior into a great one. But equally, I think once that image process is underway, and if you're a really enthusiastic top-end sort of guy looking to do your bit, then naturally you're going to choose the Templars. So I think that it encouraged people who wanted that kind of lifestyle, who wanted that elite status. So it might not be a monetary elite status, but it's like being James Bond or whatever. There's a James Bond element to this. Women want him and men want to be him. And so you get the men who want to be him joining up. So you get the best quality recruits joining the organization that can do the most with those great qualities. And it's a very, very good thing.
I quite like the idea that the rule, it's like being handed your onboarding manual on your first day in a job, but this one says, welcome to a guaranteed path to heaven through death on the battlefield. You're like, hang on, what? That's page 1.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, interestingly, so we're talking about PR departments, but we're also talking about HR departments. And I think that's one of the big things that the Templars did in the Third Crusade. It's very difficult to prove because, unlike modern HR departments, we don't have an email trail. But we do know that normally crusading armies in the early days go out to the Middle East and they are shocked because warfare out there is so different. It's like the Wild West. You're surrounded by light cavalry archers, you're stunned, you're outnumbered. It's a shocking, debilitating form of warfare for somebody who's used to facing a few peasants and, just generally riding around saying we need a change of management. But when Richard and his army arrives in the Latin East, you find them doing extraordinary things. So they're forming a kind of, they do a fighting march down the coast of Palestine, which is an incredibly complex and difficult formation. It's the kind of thing that the Templars knew all about, but those English guys didn't, and yet they hit the ground running. And then similarly, they get down to Jaffa for a battle a few months later. And there are almost no knights, but the infantry they've got, whether English or Italian rowers, whatever, they're forming very, almost like they've got salvo volley fire. And you have tiny groups where you get 2 guys in the front with the crossbows, 2 guys behind with shield and spears. You get very sophisticated tactical answers to a problem that they couldn't possibly have solved if they hadn't been taught. If somebody hadn't told them in advance, this is what we've got to do, you couldn't explain it. And I think Richard, he was clearly a ferocious leader in his own right, but I think he was man enough to talk to people who knew better than him. And I think the Templars and Hospitallers were there in his court every day, and they were imparting their knowledge. So the welcome pack started in London rather than when you hit the coast of Palestine.
Yeah, it's interesting. We think of Richard as this great general, leader, warrior, fierce individual, but like you say, that is only a result of his preparation that was done in advance, of being willing to say, I'm going somewhere I don't know, to fight enemies I don't understand. Here are the Templars who can explain all of this to me. I'm going to make good use of that so that, like you say, I can arrive and hit the deck running. And that is a big portion of the reason for his success.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, you're dealing. It's again, apropos your earlier point. Really, you're dealing with very good material. So as in who joins the Templars? He's superb military material, but he's man enough to know the things, to want to know the things he doesn't know.
And I guess the Templars are good enough as well to be that force multiplier again, to say, if we get into the ear of the King of England, we can, improve this entire army so that this small handful of Templar knights are making thousands and thousands of Christian soldiers more effective in the Holy Land.
You're 100% right. And you see this probably even more distinctively in the Second Crusade, where you get, the French army wanders over, and they've got a tiny Templar contingent. But the French army is so ill-disciplined. In fairness to them, they're behaving just like European armies normally do. They weren't any better or worse, but they were just rubbish when it came to fighting their way against Turkic cavalry in the middle of nowhere. So after they'd been cut up quite a lot, this tiny Templar contingent were told to take over. And this was hugely embarrassing for the king, but Louis was, he was man enough to do it. And everybody in the army effectively had to take an oath. Probably became a Templar associate. So they were all subject to Templar discipline. So again, to your point, the Templars may only have been 100 or 2 guys, but they transformed the whole army, and they did manage to get quite a lot of it through to the Middle East.
And I guess we've kind of talked a little bit as we've been going about the interplay between the Assassins and the Templars, which is at the absolute core of the Assassin's Creed franchise of games. And Assassin's Creed paints them as kind of mortal enemies. One of the things that I really took away from your book is just how similar in so many ways the Assassins and the Templars were, and yet do they end up being the mortal enemies that we're given in Assassin's Creed? Do Assassins and Templars hate each other? Do they not really encounter each other? How do they deal with each other in the Holy Land in the Third Crusade?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and it is surprising. I think if you're talking about Assassins and Crusaders, there's a surprisingly good relationship by and large. Wouldn't protect you. If you annoyed the Assassins, they'd still murder you.
But also, I guess if they're for hire and they want money, and Crusaders have got money, nah.
Exactly. What's a girl to do? A girl's got to make a living. So yeah, definitely. But there's no intrinsic animosity between the Crusaders and the Assassins. Partly, which sounds weird, but it's logical. The Crusaders don't take much interest in Muslim interfighting on a religious basis. They don't care if you're Sunni or Shiite or whatever. For them, it's there are other bigger issues around politics and military things. Whereas for a lot of their Muslim neighbors, they really hated the Assassins because they were these crazy murdering heretics, as they were caricatured. So there is that whole underlying lack of animosity with the Crusaders. Funnily enough, the Templars and the Hospitallers, to a lesser extent, are the exception to that. They really, really did hate each other. And I think it's partly apropos of your first point, which is that they're so similar. Love and hate being, in some ways, adjoining rather than oppositional emotions. There's an intensity about their relationship that's very unusual. And you also find that through an accident of geography, I was saying earlier that the Assassins go to Syria, they take up these great mountains and develop them into a fortress network. Those mountains are on the edge of the Crusader state called the County of Tripoli, or Principality of Antioch, but mainly Tripoli. And because the Counts of Tripoli can't control those boundaries anymore, they tend to give it to people who've got enough commitment to do it. And that's, by and large, the Hospitallers and the Templars. So you get this very prosaic sort of landlord-tenant relationship as well. So the Hospitallers and the Templars, basically they extort money from the Assassins, huge, by assassin terms, huge amounts of money. And they're able to do that because they're so similar. Because if the Count of Tripoli told the Assassins that they needed to pay him, 50 grand a year, they'd say, well, that's an interesting thought, but we know where your wife goes to get her hair cut, that kind of thing. Whereas with the Templars, there's no vulnerability. They don't have individuals within the order who aren't replaceable. If you kill the master, he'll be replaced by a temporary replacement or a permanent one, by the following day. If you kill, they don't have families, they're not married. They're not vulnerable to the promise of death that's offered by the Assassins. So every other political unit in the Middle East is scared of them. because they're basically family businesses. But the Templars and the Hospitallers are corporations. And again, that sort of works with the Assassins as well. You know, it doesn't matter how many Fideus you kill, it doesn't matter. They've already made that choice. You know, they're not scared of dying in the same way as a good Templar Knight isn't. So yeah, there is that love-hate thing. And you find that the thing between the Templars and the Assassins does rumble on down through the years, even in the 1240s and so on. The Templars insert themselves into Christian diplomacy with the Assassins to make sure that they give them a good kicking whenever they can. There is something visceral about it. And I think it's because they know each other too well.
And I guess for both those organizations, if they're quite similar, they understand just how dangerous the other ones are. Because, you know, the Templars understand what they do with such relatively small resources, at least in terms of numbers, if not money later on. They know what they can do, and they can see that the Assassins can do the same thing. So they understand perhaps better than other parties in the region on either side just how dangerous those groups could be and why you shouldn't trust them and why you should try and deal with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is a weird love, hate, respect, knowledge kind of thing all going on at the same time.
I was struck again from the book. I'm glad you drew that point out a little bit earlier. The difference between the idea that so much in the medieval world is a family business, and yet organizations like the Assassins and the Templars are much more like a corporation. So that there isn't that ability to understand that the person at the top is absolutely critical in their own body. You know, if their heir is a child, they are incredibly fragile because their dynasty will fall if they're not very, very careful. You simply don't have that issue with organizations like the Templars and the Assassins. Like you say, you know, you cut one head off and another one is growing back by the next morning. And that's difficult for other people to comprehend who are used to this idea that your son is your heir and the next generation relies entirely on him. The next generation could be the guy stood next to the guy you just killed who's better than him.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, that is, you know, it's interesting. We're sitting here talking about these two tiny corporations 800 years after the event. We're not talking about the family dynasty of the Council of Tripoli to any large extent. You know, they're invisible now. They die when their DNA dies, and it's literal DNA. It's not corporate DNA. And you find organizations like the papacy, you know, are the same in a way, and the Templars are the kind of the militant arm of the papacy. They're a corporation that supports to a corporate head office. So one pope dies, you know, which they do frequently because they're quite old, and then another one gets chosen. You can't take out the papacy. I mean, that's one of the extraordinary things about it.
How would you kind of sum up the impact of the Templars and the Assassins, two fairly small, I mean, I guess, you know, relatively not massively long-lived organizations in a region that's at conflict, at war? Is it easy to overstate their impact, or do they have a huge legacy in the region and in this period?
It does kind of speak for itself. You know, the fact that we are having this conversation shows that they had a huge impact. And, you know, with both of them, they've got a huge impact on the internet, through the gaming industry, through publishing and what have you. And that, it would be nice to think, oh, it's an accident, but clearly it isn't. You know, that doesn't happen by accident. They did have a clarity of purpose, which is just very impressive. And that's resonated down through the ages. I think they were both helped by quite specific things as well. And the fact that all the Templar records were destroyed means that they're now famous because we can impose our own, you know, they're kind of tabula rasa. So we can impose our own stories, our own conspiracies, you know, however fantastical, we can put them onto the Templars and they're fine. They can't answer back. They're, you know, and we haven't got the records. So the Hospitallers are now fairly amiable, you know, handing out oranges at football matches, as, you know, the you know, St. John's Ambulance and so on. You know, they've morphed into a sort of more benign but low profile kind of non-conspiratorial group. Whereas the Templars, who were not that different really, have become these kind of macro, you know, Marvel type figures. And I think that's true to the Assassins as well. They didn't get wiped out like the Templars, but they did get effectively neutered as a political or, you know, military force by Bars and the Mamluks. And if that hadn't happened, the Mongols would have seen them off anyway. So both groups were coming to an end. They both had a beginning and an end from a kind of macro political sense, but they both had this kind of PR resonance that lives on longer than that. And I think there is a thing, I know it, I can see it in myself, because I'm, a fairly boring person. I, open my laptop, I think I've done something really clever, whereas these guys are so resourceful and they achieve so much with so little that you can't, even though you might not agree with everything they're doing or their objectives even, you kind of think you end up rooting for them just because they're nutters, and it's sort of quite good to see what the human spirit can achieve when it focuses itself, for good or bad, on things with clarity.
And I realise that we've talked a bit about Sinan, the old man of the mountain, kind of leader of the assassins during the Third Crusade. We've not really talked about who was in charge of the Templars, and he's a figure who appears in the game. Players will duel with Robert de Sablé. So is he really the leader of the Templars? Does he die during the Third Crusade?
Yeah, that is all true. Yeah, absolutely. Sadly, we know more about him before he became a Templar, but he was a real character. And again, we haven't got a lot of flesh to put on the bones, but when you look at his career, it's obvious that the guy had huge charisma and talent. He's a really butch diplomat. He's able to mediate between kings, between different armies, and he's doing really well there. He's a military man, so before he becomes a Templar, he's one of Richard the Lionheart's admirals. Being an admiral was very largely a kind of more like a land-based military role in those days, of course. And then because Richard is leading, most of the Third Crusade, the Templars quite rightly think, I know what, we'll take one of Richard's key allies and make him the master of the entire order. And it's fabulous. It's an area where you can see Templar diplomacy working really well. And I think it also plays into our conversation about, the HR arm of the Templars. You basically take the guy who's closest to Richard and you make him the Templar. You impart all the Templar knowledge. And that's not arcane knowledge. It's knowledge of how to deal with Turkish cavalry, those kind of knowledge. And then you inject that into the whole of the crusade. So it's a very clever, very simple, but clever stuff.
It's that corporate thinking again, isn't it? Of headhunting someone who can bring the connections that can improve your business no end.
Absolutely. It's, you go to your executive search people, you say, I want, the best CEO for the corporation at this time. He doesn't need to be there forever, but he is there at the right time, at the right place. And he's bossed in to make sure that Richard feels comfortable knowing that the Templars are, they're close. They're really close allies and they can really help. And they recognize in Richard somebody who can make a crusade happen. And they're the ones who can make it better. So it's a wonderfully symbiotic thing. And Robert Sablé died quite early on. I mean, I do love Assassin's Creed, what I've seen of it. But I love it from the same sense that I love Kingdom of Heaven. It's not historically accurate, but it never pretends to be. If you were judging it as a lecture series, you'd say, well, it's not accurate. But if you judge it as a game that gives you a kind of intimate sense of time and place, it's superb. So you can see how it works really well. I think that the danger with academics is that you're inclined to judge everything from your own perspective rather than the perspective of the media you're working with. So Kingdom of Heaven, sumptuous, just looks beautiful. And it's, some of the history is a bit crazy, but it sucks you into that world. And I think that's where Assassin's Creed is great as well. It introduces that part of history to a lot of people who wouldn't have ever had any reason to know anything about it at all.
I mean, this has been absolutely fascinating, Stephen. I fear I could do this all day quite happily and never get bored of talking to you about these things. But obviously, if people want to know more, they can definitely go and get your book and immerse themselves in the world of the Assassins and the Templars. But before we finish, I like to give guests the opportunity to step into the Assassin's Creed Animus and be transported in full safety. You will be returned back to 2025. Back to a moment. So is there a moment in Assassin or Templar history, a battle or an encounter that you wish that you could see, that you would love to witness?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There is one particular assassin hit that doesn't work. And I like it because it kind of doesn't work. And that's the first significant attack on Saladin. So they're almost there. There's 13 guys go in, they get to his tent, they're just outside the tent, and then somebody says, hold on, you look familiar. What are you doing here? And it's like, simple question, what are you doing here? but there's no simple answer other than, oh, we've come to kill Saladin. And then all hell breaks loose, and and they carve their way through a lot of bodyguards and so on. And that to me it's a failure, but it's the assassins sort of at their best. They managed to get so close. And then there's another story I love as well. If I can have two, another little one. There's a classic one that shows how the assassins are human as well. There's an attack on a castle, a Muslim castle in Shazar, which is the lovely sort of fortified town and castle. And 100 assassins kind of blag their way in, start carving their way through the garrison and everything. And they then get beaten by a bunch of middle-aged ladies who are left behind. All the garrison have gone off carousing. They're off at a party. So the whole place is empty. And these middle-aged women and slaves jam all the doors. They hand out the armor amongst themselves. They get ready to kill themselves if they get attacked. They stand by the balconies, with their swords, so that it's either death one way or the other. You kill the enemy or suicide. And the assassins are rubbish. They mess up the whole thing, and the men come back and wipe them out to a single man. But I go on about it a lot in the book because I just think it's lovely that it's a personal antidote to the kind of ninja-esque aspects of it. They were superb at what they did, but none of us is, perfect.
Yeah, definitely we should put them up on a pedestal, but then give that pedestal a wobble every once in a while just to remind them.
Very much so.
This has been absolutely fascinating, Steve. Thank you so much for joining us here on Echoes of History. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, thank you, Matt. You're great as ever.
Thanks for watching Echoes of History. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the real history behind the Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe for more episodes. You can check out the extended interviews wherever you get your podcasts by clicking the link in the description. You should also hit the links that are floating on the screen somewhere. Are they on my face? They're on my face again, aren't they? Get them off. Follow a link, please.